And GZERO is still here at the spring meetings. A major theme this week, of course, is the financing needed to advance development goals. There's obviously been a number of setbacks over the past couple of years. And I'm here with Shari Spiegel. She's the director of the Financing for Sustainable Development Office within the UN. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
And the report that your organization just recently released is very sobering about just how far off we are on those goals and how much more money it's going to take. But first, I don't want to assume that everybody really knows what the SDGs are. So why don't you just quickly explain the program?
So the Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. These were agreed by basically all countries in the world in 2015 as a set of goals that we all need to aspire to and achieve by 2030. So the first set of goals are social goals, including eradicating poverty, hunger, education, and then there are a set of economic goals, which includes both infrastructure issues, water, energy for all, and economics, including decent jobs, for example. And then there are the set of environmental goals, which of course include climate. And the goal is in Goal 17 is the financing goal, which is getting enough financing and resources and capacities to be able to implement the other 16 goals.
So last year, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres described these development goals as being on life support. Mm-hmm. Strikes me that the problem has become even more dire right now. So just give us a sense of when we're talking about how far off we are on things like poverty and hunger, what does that mean?
Right. So even prior to the COVID, the SDGs were off track. And so then, of course, with the crisis and the global crisis, countries went backwards. And so we actually started backtracking on many of these goals as countries were under enormous stress, and particularly the poorest countries. So during the COVID crisis, there was, when the global economy in many ways shut down and global trade shut down in many ways, those countries that are the poorest are the ones, SIDS, the small island developing states, that their global output, I think, fell by 40%, and LDCs, least developed countries, the poorest countries in the world, by 30%. So even though now the global economic growth is, as you heard this week, that there's, it's not as bad, the expectations of growth have been upgraded so that it's more of a thinking of a soft landing. That's really for the developed world and for really led by the U.S. But when you look at many of what we've highlighted in the report is that there's an enormous finance divide, and that the poorest countries that just because the global growth is not as bad as expected, the poorest countries are still being hit really hard.
And that gap that you're talking about, the financing gap, is in the trillions. It's not a small amount of money,
right? In fact, it went from, the estimates were $2 trillion a year prior to the crisis was needed for just in developing countries, and now it's seen as a $4 trillion gap. A big chunk of that is for renewable energy, and a big chunk of it's for infrastructure, but the gap is seen as $4 trillion.
Geopolitical competition is obviously a large factor right now, but then again, so is just flat up politics and the guarantee that a leader of a developed nation will have the same level of support for multilateralism. Do you fear that the 2024 election, particularly in the United States, could have a negative impact on the funding that you need?
Well, as a working at the UN, we try to not think through particular elections and how particular. I would say that more broadly, there is geopolitical risk, and more broadly, there are geopolitical pressures that have enormous economic implications. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why, because I sit in the UN, where we work a lot with foreign affairs ministries. And now here we are in DC, where it's mostly finance ministries. But many of the issues that we're all thinking about, these are issues related to how the international financial architecture supports growth and development of poor countries, but also sustainable investment in sustainable development. And in a world where we have increasing systemic risks, what should this architecture look like to be able to support countries to grow and to grow sustainably? So many of those issues have become very political. And it's very, very hard now to separate the political from the economic. And so it's very important, we think, to bring these two sides together and to really bring finance ministries, foreign affairs ministries, because the discussions in New York that reflect the political implications of a lot of these policies have enormous long-term impacts if we're not able to bring countries together. So really, one of the big thinking in the UN is, how do we re-strengthen multilateralism, re-strengthen trust in the international system? And to that extent, I don't know, in 2025, there will be a Financing for Development conference in Spain, which is mandated to look at some of these really big issues, brings every country in the world together. And we're really hoping to use that as a time to bring both the foreign affairs, the political side together with the finance side to see the political implications as well as the economic political implications, and the economics along with the social, along with the environmental, together to understand how all of this works as a system coherently together.
You mentioned trust. I know that's one of the action items within this report. So why do you think trust in multilateralism and even within the UN has been eroded?
You can just look around the world. There are so many, it's a period of just a lot of uncertainty and a lot of geopolitical tensions. And so I think why it's been eroded, we can see around us. I think the bigger challenge is how we can overcome that and what steps that we all can take to try to rebuild the trust that's been challenged. And so we very much hope that that the only way to do that is to talk. And so as hard as some of the dialogue is, and as different as countries' perspectives are, the goal is to bring countries together to be able to find where we have common ground and how we can move forward together.
So the 17 goals were always ambitious,
right,
even in the very beginning, and now looking much more so. But where are the glimmers of hope, and where do you see real priority that could potentially take you across the line in the next 5-6 years?
Right. There was always this idea that countries are responsible for their own development, but the international community and system is responsible for an enabling international environment and now for sustainable development, as well as support for countries that need it most. And there is now the international system, however, was designed 80 years ago, and in a world that was very different than today, in a world where the institutions were set up to help Europe rebuild after the war, and where many of the countries that we are now part of the UN system weren't even independent countries at that time. And so there's a real push to rethink what the system, that international enabling environment to give countries the ability to grow, how that has to be reframed. And more so probably than has ever been the case, this realization that this needs to be rethought. What is the role of the World Bank? What is the role of the IMF? How can they better support countries in a world of increasing systemic risks, particularly climate risks? And as I said, this conference in 2025, the fourth conference on financing for development in Spain, is an opportunity to think about all of those pieces cohesively together. But I think that despite the fact that there's a lot of change happening, really a lot, it's not enough because the challenges are happening even faster. And so that's why we have to take these changes and continue to raise the ambition of them, because this is an opportunity, a real opportunity, to rethink how do we make the system fit for purpose for the world we live in today.
And well, 2025 seems so close. When you only have 6 years to meet those goals, every minute counts.
Right.
Shari Spiegel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Bye.